Right. Welcome back to the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs on this lovely Wednesday, March 1st. We are picking up our consideration of the Vermont Criminal Justice Council recommendations bill. That's drafting request 230959. And we are here today. We have Executive Director of the VCJC, Heather Simons, and Deputy Director Brickell are both on with us on Zoom. Welcome back to the committee.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So I'm just gonna pull this up. Director and Deputy Director, would you do you have any comments or testimony that you'd like to give in addition to what we've heard on the bill? I asked you to be in the room mostly so that you could respond to some of the other folks that I had asked to weigh in on the bill as well. But just wanted to see if you had any opening remarks since these recommendations came originally from your office.
Yes, good morning. Heather Simons for the record, Executive Director, Vermont Criminal Justice Council. We can do either. I think if you want to jump to witnesses, we can provide context at the end, or we can get a little more granular up front. It may be better to stand down and then we can answer questions, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that would be good. So why don't I go ahead and invite Sheriff Mark Anderson to come and offer his feedback since he's here with us today. And I really appreciate you bringing some outside perspective from a law enforcement leader on some of the things that are in this bill. So thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. For the record, Mark Anderson, Windham County Sheriff. I want to be clear because I wear many hats. I am here as the Windham County Sheriff, not as the president of the Sheriff's Association or a variety of other things that I do. I am a member of the council. I'm not speaking for the council. I think you've already heard that, but these are very much my own thoughts and opinions. With regards to training, there's obviously many agencies in the state will talk about the employment crisis they're in. I'm fortunate that I don't have that crisis. I think Representative Muricky has asked me why, and I don't have a good answer. So we're lucky. I don't expect to be lucky forever. And then we'll go back to the problem we had 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 10 years ago, where we received 3 applications and they're disqualified immediately for having felonies. So training is part of hiring. It's part of the indoctrination of bringing people into fair and ethical law enforcement training or service. And it's how we ensure that people are doing all the things the way that we want them to do it. Historically, the Vermont Police Academy has notoriously been underfunded. We can talk about the reasons that happened. I will surmise to say it's the typical Vermont organic answer because we found a way to just figure it out. So we don't have, I don't want to insinuate no one's professional here. We don't have a professional instructional staff. We have law enforcement officers who are donated by their agency to be instructors. And that's a great thing to have. I'm an instructor myself. It's a great thing for my agency when people need to receive the curriculum that I'm able to teach. I'm certified by the council as that instructor, and we offer classes regionally, but we also offer classes right through the academy. When I can't access classes, that's a problem. And when I can't access classes because, say, a criminal law instructor from the city of Burlington isn't available because he's covering shift or because she is tied up on a call, then I just don't have access to that class. That's not the fault of the academy. It's not the fault of the instructor who's incapable of getting there. It's the fault that we haven't resourced professional training staff. We can also look at the model. We've been operating a model that considers, at least in statute, considers 3 levels of certification: level 1, level 2, and level 3. Level 1 operationally is not used at this time. There are no level 1 certified officers. The fundamental requirements for training are so close, if not the same as a level 2 officer. It just doesn't make sense to train level 1 if we can get a higher degree of certification. Level 2, you'll see a variety of use cases in the state of Vermont. My office uses level 2 officers not only as part of our hiring regimen. We feel that we can identify if a person is fit for the role by seeing them work and how they interact with people and in a position of power, while also with some very necessary guardrails. And so we hire them in level 2. And we see them work for about a year, and through their work ethic, through their treatment of people, that's when we say this person should be hired as a full-time employee. This person has what we're looking for, and then we send them to the level 3 academy. The difficulty is for me as an agency head, I need to send a person away to training. It's the full-time academy is roughly 18 weeks. I need to send them away to that. I'm paying their salary. It's about $20,000 to train one individual. And I'm not funded by any sort of tax source to train a deputy. I'm not able to do that. And so we do it through contracts. Anyone familiar with contracts will know that, well, people want to see what they're getting for their money. And so when I say I need to send someone to training and they say, well, why are we paying your training cost? It's a great question. We do it, we make it work, but it's not an ideal system. Again, it's organic Vermont coming together to develop a solution where it hasn't come together before. I have an idea. It's not a new idea. I've shared it with academy staff. I'm not here to say this needs to happen today. I think that there's a lot of things that need to happen today, and I think this is part of a long conversation about training. But it's not really a new idea. In fact, it's implemented in the trades. We see people who will enter into, I'll use an electrician's program, they enter as an apprentice. Well, we kind of already do that right now with law enforcement officers who go to level 2. They go to in-person class. They work with a certified trainer for a number of weeks. They receive additional classes for a number of weeks. And then eventually when we say they're ready to work by themselves, they work by themselves. And so that level 2 person, for me, they do transports. They're working with another officer to move people around the state of Vermont from correctional facilities to court to correctional facilities. They are helping keep construction workers safe by running blue lights and slowing traffic down on the interstate or on some of the local roads. And then we're beginning with very low level on-the-job training. We're beginning to integrate them into some basic patrol functions. So it might be doing some traffic enforcement in an area with a supervisor nearby. So if they get into something that's over their head, they have a safety net. So with the trades, we have the apprentice. The next level, you're ready to go on your own. It's the journeyman. And at the journeyman level, they're able to do those things, the traffic enforcement things. They're able to work within their scope of practice that's defined in statute. And then we move, as we send them to the full-time academy, we move to that next level, more that expert level. And so what I've been advocating is rather than we have these certification levels that you either have some of it or all of it, let's make it modular. So if to have a level 3 certification, I need to have training on crime scene processing. Well, if I can go to the crime scene processing class and receive that class, that works towards overall that curriculum that's required. There's arguments against this model saying it won't incorporate physical fitness. Well, I was able to accomplish physical fitness requirements through a variety of educational environments that I was required to go to without having to have a phys ed teacher looking over me. We submit work logs or whatever we had to do. So there's a variety of ways looking at the trades model to say we can modularize this, we can make it accessible. It can start pushing some programs to an electronic learning system. So we don't necessarily need to wait for an instructor. CPR for me, I mean, each year we say, okay, how many breaths and how many compressions? Because each year my department's trained on that. Not that we need it, that's literally our questions. So to that end, I could probably talk for an hour, but that's kind of my high level summary of give me the ability to access training, give the academy the resources to provide training, and let's make it so that we can get more people within or into the current void of employment that can do the things and not have to wait 4 months, 6 months, 12 months, 24 months, just so we can fill that one slot. That's my piece on training.
So could I just ask, since we're in the process of weighing in not only on the policy in this bill, but also the budget request that the Criminal Justice Council made from, your perspective as a manager of a law enforcement agency, is that the right path for us to go on? Obviously, you mentioned some of the things that we really need to consider during that process, but or should this committee be saying, yeah, we're on the right track on that, do that 3-year phase in of additional resources?
If the academy is saying that you're on the right track and the council saying you're on the right track, I trust them because everything I reviewed in this bill request are things we've talked about for a long time. And at the end of the day, they're common sense, reasonable approaches towards a better system. If my idea is the better system, I'm happy. If there's another idea that's better than my idea, I'm happy, as long as it's getting us people filling the voids that are currently causing other agencies to struggle. Being full staffed, I now get calls to help support other agencies. And so I was in Bennington and Windsor counties supporting those agencies because, well, I had the depth on the bench. I'd rather those counties be able to do their work so we can focus on our work. But that's, we're helpers. We try to help.
Any questions for Sheriff Anderson on training? I think you're endorsing the Academy's proposal is helpful. Thanks.
I'm glad to hear that. And if you're looking for other voices, I'm sure you've heard them before, but the Chiefs Association, formerly the Sheriff's Association, will be my face again. And I don't know if my association doesn't have a position yet because I was ignorant to this bill. So I was surprised when I found myself coming in to testify. I thought I was coming in for a different reason. Here we are. I didn't read my email and that's on me. The Department of Public Safety, I think that they would certainly also have a perspective. So just wanted to throw those out.
We have an opinion as well. Yes, Representative Murphy.
Thanks for coming, Mark. One of the things I think we want to hear from, I want to hear from as we look at this bill, the headline or beginning of the bill is we want to repeal the fixed hours of training. And my understanding is to set up some competency levels, though. Tell me how that would work from your perspective.
So a lot of law enforcement training, I'm going to talk about, I'll talk about driving. Everybody drives. We teach emergency vehicle operations for driving an emergency vehicle because I might need to go from 70 miles an hour to immediately stop, turn around, hit a U-turn on the interstate, drive the other way. Nobody does that. It might be I need to drive 80 miles an hour to an emergency that's happening now that's an hour away. So I think driving is a good model for us to visualize competency. We can see people who are effective drivers versus new drivers and drivers ed training. And so when we say, okay, this person falls below the threshold of the competency, they need additional training. I like to use our current presence on YouTube as a good example of online learning. I can take my CPR class online. I can watch a YouTube video. And I'm guessing that if any of the members of the committee use YouTube like I do to watch what's going on in some of these bills, well, I turn it to 1.5 speed. So if it's a 2-hour meeting, I just spend an hour of my time watching the hearing as opposed to 2 hours. So if I take a 4-hour CPR class, but I run it at 1.5 speed, I get the same content. As long as I'm competent to apply the number of compressions and give the appropriate number of breaths and perform the technique correctly. I think competency is a better model because I have seen people be very quick learns or quick studies to a variety of skill sets that we train, whether it's around the implementation of defensive tactics or de-escalation. And I've seen people who they've completed the requisite number of hours who missed the boat and they just need more training, but they completed the class and they're capable. So I think competency is a better model. I think that with a qualified, standardized curriculum, which generally the council through the academy provides, we have those standards set. And generally speaking, they're defensible against national organizations who are sponsoring the underlying program or through professional recognition of best practices.
To follow up on Representative Murwicki's question, I think one of the things that came up as we looked at this initial recommendation about moving from hours to competency thinking is that it's easy for us in statute to say, do 4 hours on this thing. It's harder, I think, for us to define what competency is, especially I think it's easier when you give something like, oh, there's a skill that can be observed by a trainer and say they've got it. The fair and impartial policing is one where I'm just wondering, sort of as this evolves, how do we make sure that the officers that we're figuring out how to have them demonstrate competency and understanding that policy and implementing it?
Sure. So I'm going to identify two organizations, the council itself, as well as the Law Enforcement Advisory Board. These are professional organizations with professional skill sets who understand what competencies are. And I think it doesn't need to be legislated per se, like this is the competency for emergency vehicle operations driving. The legislature is identifying, we want the LEAB, the council, or another organization to identify that standard. And so maybe fair and impartial policing is a collaboration of work that's reported back to the committee, but not so much the committee saying this is how to do it. We want you to do it and come back and tell us how you came up with it. And as long as that's satisfactory, that's fine. If it's not satisfactory, you can continue providing that overall guidance in coming sessions.
Representative Waters-Evans.
Thank you. All right. Hi. So if we have, let's say that I am training and I cannot stop going 70 miles an hour and turn around and go the other direction, but I've completed my 3 hours of driving training. Are you still going to let me go out and drive? Or is there like because I've completed those hours as opposed to the competency? Do you see what I'm asking?
I do.
Like, can you say, no, you're not good enough, you have to do those 3 hours again? Or is it just, you get a stamp and you keep going?
So yes, in both regards. A person who's completed the training is qualified to do it. Me as an agency head will look at that and say, that is a liability and a half, and I don't want to be sued. So I'm going to intercede to say, you keep running into cars. Well, you're not driving cars because they cost too much. I can't afford them. So very often this is on agency heads to ensure that the appropriate interventions are in place. So using defensive tactics, if I have a person who's using excessive defensive tactics, not only do I have a responsibility to report that to the council, but I also don't want the fallout of that. I mean, we want people treated appropriately. We want de-escalation to be used. I don't want to see injuries occurring. So with that, if we're identifying it, we're also going to intervene from an agency perspective. But we also expect the council to intervene from its professional responsibility oversight perspective as well. So I guess in summary, yes, we'll intervene, but yes, they're qualified, unless they're not qualified. There are other ways that disqualification can happen, but specific to the hours, if they accomplish the objectives of the class, they've accomplished it.
You're going to tell us a little bit about the
traffic stop rate data. So I'm a self-identified computer geek. I don't expect other people to be that, and I'm happy with my association in that regard. Because of that, going back about 4 years now, when some of the consequences to agencies were enacted, I was reaching out to some of the sheriffs to say, like, why aren't you compliant? Now, well, the initial assumption was they just didn't want to do it. And what I found is it was actually technical competency. One sheriff said, I don't even know how to run that report. So I said, it's just as easy for me to run it for you as it is to run it for me. So I'll just do it for you if you're okay with that. And we worked it out. And long story short, we have progressed as a state. We have progressed from 4 records management systems down to generally 1. We talk about a Little Spillman, which is this little island of 3 agencies, but everyone's pretty much on the same system. And so through me doing it for a couple sheriffs and a couple chiefs, it eventually became I'm the person who's running the report for everyone. So I have a very organic solution to what was agencies not being in compliance and trying to bring them into compliance because there was willingness to do so. There's just lack of the skill set. So through this work, I want to flag that I think there's more work to do on this. And I say that the more work to do is an acorn in what is the RDAP committee's tree. There's a small piece, as we talk about the current report that's generated, that requires a lot of work, and I would say overhaul, because it does not fit what researchers would tell us today are the best practices. It's the best thing we got right now, so I'm not even opposed to adding on the additional language. In 2019, the chiefs and sheriffs had their annual meeting, and the chiefs and sheriffs all mutually agreed that we should be providing more data. And so I think one reference is the current enumerated list of data points that are reported out. That should be considered the floor. But it's permissive for us to have more stuff without any legislation required. There's been agencies who are frustrated because they end up in lawsuits, frustrated because they run a data set one way and then later on a data set's run another way and they don't necessarily compare. And there's a lot of very technical reasons why all of that happens. But this is where we want to make sure we have a standardized practice to have apples to apples comparisons across the state. The chiefs and the sheriffs agreed, like, hey, we have a list of, I think it was 20 different data points researchers suggested that they wanted to include. And we said, yeah, no problem. So 2021, I believe, was the last year that we had 4 different systems at play. Now, for the next reported year, we are going to have all of it coming out of a system called Valcor. That's what all Vermont law enforcement agencies use. This is how we are generating e-tickets. So a deputy stops a car, they issue a ticket, it's electronically submitted to the judiciary, it's provided to the defendant. We have just one person entering the information instead of 3 now, so it cuts out some excess. It eliminates operator error in many cases, but with that, it also collects the data that we need as part of that ticket generating process. So we can add those data points fairly easy. And again, it's me who's writing the report right now, and I'd like to hand it off to someone, but anyways, that's a different problem. Being able to output those things is doable. Adding a date, time are an issue. Location, we just want to be somewhat sensitive that we're not going to be creating personally identifiable information. And then I know that the Department of Public Safety was working on a report, a heat map report, and it dialed crime down to like the hundreds block. And I was like, well, in Windham County, the hundreds block is pretty obvious. There's one house on this road. So we know exactly where the house is coming for crime data, which is not the intent. So with location, street name would probably be sufficient, but we want to be mindful that there are street names with 2 houses on it and they're private drives. And we might be issuing traffic violations on those private drives. So whether location's necessary by street name versus break it down to the town, which again, that's simple. I mean, there's options. I think that the chiefs and sheriffs are generally pursuing those. Again, my personal opinion. And we have an expanded report that we're looking to push out. The only reason why the data set that the council has received is based on the statutory enumeration is because we had some agencies who were getting sued, and we could broadly say, well, we have to follow the law, so we can do that. All the data points are still accessible by public records requests. So it's not really a leap of the imagination to say the chiefs and sheriffs would oppose this because the information could be obtained anyways. But my opinion, let the chiefs and sheriffs talk for themselves.
So right now in our bill, we're just adding date, time, and location. We did not get so granular to say exactly what the location should be. So, I mean, can you support the language as it is, and we'll leave it to the Criminal Justice Council and law enforcement agencies to determine how granular they need to be? Should we specify how vague or specific we want that to be?
I would leave it to the council's assessment or law enforcement's assessment, however that needs to be. Listening to researchers, they're going off of modern science. They're talking about things that I've heard them, but I don't know the bodies of study behind it, and they do. I could give you some people who could come before you to talk about what the research is, but I'm not that good at it. I would just say we want to be sensitive to not personally identifying people because we don't want the, ooh, you're in the principal's office banter going on. And that's partly why we don't want the granular specificity when we're talking about just a public release of information.
Anything else you'd like to comment on the bill?
I think that is everything from my perspective. I mean, generally speaking, the council had their list of things to improve. These are nothing new. We've talked about them for years. So I'm happy to see the committee consider it and looking forward to improvements.
Any last questions for Sheriff Anderson? Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for your time.
And I'll make sure anytime there's a bill, we have two committee bills that have to do with law enforcement at the same time. I really make sure that you know which one we're talking about. So Tim Ash is here from the auditor's office. Tim, are you with us? Thank you. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you. If you're ready for me to roll, I will jump right in.
Yes, would love to hear your feedback on the draft bill language that's before us.
Great. For the record, Tim Ash, Deputy State Auditor. I'll keep my remarks very brief in the interest of time and to give the others a chance to answer any other questions. So quick backstory, the reason the Auditor's Office has a particular interest in this is we did conduct an audit which was completed in 2022 relating to the VCJC's oversight of the training requirements, and 3 recommendations were made to the legislature out of that audit. So I'm just going to speak quickly to how the draft appears to relate to those recommendations. I submitted a document which is up on your website, which provides a little bit more detail. So the first recommendation related to this issue of minimum hours of fair and impartial policing training versus compared to the draft, which uses a competency approach. On the one hand, the competency approach will clean up the statutory ambiguity, which had that holdover language about 4 hours. And that's a policy question for the committee to make. And so in that sense, we don't have an opinion. We would offer one word of caution about the competency approach, and your discussion with Sheriff Anderson touched on this a little. As an example, in our audit, one of the officers whose records were reviewed, the documentation suggested that the fair and impartial policing module that officer took for I believe the biennial training was completed in just 1 to 2 minutes. And presumably that curriculum was meant to move towards competency, but I suspect that the legislature's intent would be for an officer to engage a little bit longer than as few as 1 or 2 minutes on an issue as critical as fair and impartial policing. So similar to Sheriff Anderson, if the competency approach is the one that you take, I would recommend that you direct the VCJC to come back to the committee and communicate what that looks like so that you can be sure that it matches your expectations on this issue. The worst case, I've been in your shoes, is that you grant a certain amount of flexibility to the agency, then you learn you're not happy with it, and then you've got to haul them back in and try to correct. So this way you'd be establishing that feedback loop, just as Sheriff Anderson suggested. One of the recommendations was related to A-RIDE training. As you know, the previous legislation had required by a date certain that all officers would be required to be A-RIDE trained. The draft that you have addresses that by eliminating that requirement and setting up effectively a rulemaking process through VCJC. So that covers that recommendation. And then the third recommendation we had, which does not appear in the draft, but I just want to encourage you to at least consider revisiting it, is the issue of a provision which the legislature passed several years ago, which would deny access to VCJC services for any law enforcement agency that had not adopted satisfactory policies related to things like body cameras, use of conducted electric weapons like tasers, and fair and impartial policing. The legislation did not require at the time for body cameras and CEWs that anyone verify that the policies were consistent with the model policies, which were meant to be the minimally accepted policies. So while they were filed, there wasn't really a process established to make sure they were sufficient. In the case of fair and impartial policing, there is an initial review by the Attorney General's office, but then any subsequent changes a law enforcement agency may make to either that policy or body cameras or CEWs, no one reviews those to make sure that the policies are still acceptable. So to give two examples from our audit that highlight why those might have real world consequences, the failure to keep verifying the appropriateness of the policies. One agency that we reviewed in the audit somewhat strangely removed language from their CEW policy discouraging using a taser or another CEW on the abdomen of a pregnant woman. That could have been a deletion that was accidental. We don't have a understanding of why that occurred. But right now there is a CEW policy that has removed what I would think is a fairly important safety precaution in the CEW policy. Another agency in their fair and impartial policing policy had, there's the model policy suggests that superior officers will be making sure that the officers who serve underneath them are compliant with the FIP policy and effectively removed the language to merely suggest that once a year at a roll call, the FIP policy would be referenced. Again, this doesn't mean that the policy itself should be tossed aside, but that's the kind of thing that might have real implications for how a department is really incorporating the fair and impartial policing concept into their work throughout the year, not just once at a roll call. So those are just two examples of what are currently unreviewed modifications to these policies, which the legislature had felt very strongly about, such so that they required them. So I'll leave my comments there. I'm happy to field any questions, but we're very happy to see that the committee has been taking up these issues. And I spoke fast because I promised I could do it in 5 minutes, although I have a 2-hour version. I have a 2-hour version I'm happy to go for. Trust me.
No, you've given us some good feedback, Tim. I think that the suggestion of a report back around competency, I think making the number of hours requirement, Criminal Justice Council and Legislative Council worked together and brought us some of this draft language to start working on here in committee. And this idea of getting rid of the required number of hours and substituting with competency, I think probably the best thing we can do if we go in that direction is to have some kind of a report back built in. And so I'll stew with the committee on that recommendation a little bit when we do our discussion after the floor this afternoon.
And Mr. Chair, just on that point, and in the formal testimony I submitted, we do make the point that the VCJC may very well establish a competency approach that will be quite successful. I don't believe anywhere in statute there's a required number of hours for the domestic violence training, which is required to occur biennially. That which Heather or Chris could answer, but I believe is about 2 hours. And we've not heard any concerns from people who work in that field that the training isn't a good one. I think they do it collaboratively with the network and others. So the competency approach can work. It's just important that the committee has confidence that it's giving the appropriate amount of weight and importance to the officers who are receiving it so that it's not a box to check.
Questions for the auditor's office about the audit or their feedback on the bill? Tim, thank you for bringing the auditor's office perspective and for providing all the information from the audit. It's really helped inform my thinking about the bill and things to look out for. So thanks for being with us today. I appreciate the time.
Sure thing. And if any questions, feel free, obviously, to direct them to me. And if I might just drop one last morsel for the committee, this is it's a bit of a historical item, but it speaks to it's sort of the genesis of a number of these requirements and the desire of the legislature at the time to make sure that the desire would be carried out. There was another provision added in Title III. This is really about the administration that, and this, I mentioned this because you just had a brief conversation about traffic data reporting. The language more or less says in Title III that the administration shall not issue any grants to law enforcement agencies who have not complied with that traffic data reporting requirement. The Secretary of Administration presumably is the one who would make that determination. And there's two issues just for you to think about, maybe not in the context of this bill. One is it doesn't seem that there actually is a mechanism by which the Secretary of Administration currently is enforcing that provision. And in our work, we did look through the system to see that virtually all departments were submitting information. It was not clear one way or the other whether it was 100% of the traffic data or something less than 100%. That's something the law enforcement agencies and the VCJC may have more insights. But for anyone on the committee for whom this is an important, particularly important issue, you may wish to pursue that offline.
Okay. Lots to think about. Thank you, Tim.
Okay. Thanks.
Have a good one.
Yeah.
Director Simons, we've gotten a number of things laid on the table here as feedback on the draft language. So I want to open it up for you to respond to some of what we've heard.
Thank you. Again, Heather Simons, Executive Director of the Vermont Criminal Justice Council. And I appreciate Sheriff Anderson going first. That helps give some context as well as Auditor Ash with regards to some of the audit findings. So let me just, what I want to do is I want to address the training hours discussion, back up and clear up any confusion around what the intent is with us. And I'll start by saying our suggestion to go towards a competency model requires more work for us, a lot more attention to detail, and a very deep dive into what competencies are for law enforcement in general. This last week is the first time I've heard or even thought of concern that going in the direction of a competency model would be an attempt to reduce hours. And maybe I'm wearing my rose tinted glasses, but that had not occurred to us. That's not where we come from. That's not part of the national model for instructional theory and to practice. But competency-based training is a way to hold people accountable and to get away from what we call an attendance model. So if you're required to go to 2 hours of training, all you're required to do is go. That is what makes me nervous as an executive. That's not meaningful. So competency-based models bring in skill-based training, scenarios, real life situations, and a way for you to be able to hear from us so that we can tell you when you finish that training, you'll be able to do the following. Fair and impartial policing is an excellent example of a topic that could be 4 hours, 40 hours, 4 years, a PhD. It covers a lot of area. The requirement for fair and impartial policing was 4 hours. And folks had to go for 4 hours. They weren't required to participate. It was a delivery model. It was during COVID, and that meant that there were also some avenues to attend it remotely. So you could attend it remotely from your office, you could attend it remotely from your home, or you could attend it remotely from the beach. And that, in fact, happened. So I just want to be clear with this committee that we are looking to create a learning environment that replicates what has to happen on the road and at work, and that is meaningful interaction. Now, traditionally, we've always seen competency models in use of force training. That's not unusual. That the focus of use of force training is on muscle memory and repetition, so that there is no forgetting what to do in the moment. That's a competency model. It gets what people consider softer skills. That's when we start to get away from competency and start providing more latitude than we ought to. And that's in areas like de-escalation and communication. We really ought not to be practicing the skills of communication in a high crisis situation online. That's not an online training. That's a training where you need to be together with people, practicing real life situations and measuring for the skill level. And to Sheriff Anderson's point around, I don't know if he said CPR or first aid and CPR, but there are some trainings because of the liability that you're going to have to do every year, and we're not trying to get around that either. But the reality is that for me to come to you and tell you what we're bringing for content is going to be much more efficient through a competency model. That also allows for us to have varying levels. And we can't assess the varying levels of law enforcement until we know what the expectation of law enforcement is. And the job of the Sheriff's Department has different expectations on the job than Vermont State Police, than municipalities, et cetera. So we are required to deliver the training to make sure that these various levels of certification and various agencies get what they need to do what they're supposed to do on the job. So competency models basically in a nutshell, it's that we're reversing what the expectation is. More often than not, people will say, well, that's a problem over here. They should have had 40 hours of training. And we've all become in the bad habit of just applying hours to problems. And we can't fix problems with hours. We can fix it with training. And we're training, if you want to know whether, honestly, a policy falls apart, it's going to be at the training. If we can't implement it, then we can't train it. And that's where it seems to bubble up. Things like attendance, awareness, sensitivity, all those topics on trainings, they're very difficult to measure. We're looking to replicate the expectation that you have and that Vermont has for meaningful interaction, the least restrictive, the least forceful intervention on the job. And we can train that. That is a skill, and we can test out on it. It's by no means an attempt to provide less training. And I'm aware of the example of someone hopping on and logging in and completing a training in 1 minute. That's not a reason to go away from competency. It's exactly the reason to go towards it. And it's as concerning to me as it would be for the auditors. That's not meaningful training. And that isn't going to be, we're not going to be able to show a difference in how we deliver practice and show that we know what to do on the job without doing that. So I can answer questions, it's a pretty detailed, that model, but I'll leave it there in terms of what the intent is in the context around the discussion.
Director Simons, while we're on that, I think one thing that might be helpful, or sort of two thoughts that come to mind. One is there an example of how the officer being trained demonstrates competency in the fair and impartial policing? Like in the models you're talking about, is it a test? Is it an evaluation? Like at the end of a training on that kind of a subject that does require some demonstration of knowledge of a policy and really it's almost like interpersonal skills, right? How is that demonstrated in the kind of policies that you're talking about?
It's not. That's my point, that it's the requirement is to attend. And if we were truly going to tackle this, first question is, what is fair and impartial policing? What does that look like? If you are practicing fair and impartial policing, what does that constitute on the job? What are you required to do on the job? And then that's how you build training. You start there and you go backwards. So if this is what you need to do on the job, then what skills do we need to train you in to get there? And then the national model that is used in a lot of places uses things, objectives called enabling objectives and terminal objectives. Terminal objectives of by the time you're done with the training, what do you want to see on the job? Enabling objectives are what has to happen to get you there? What do you have to pass? The first week of training or the first hour of training, what do you have to be able to do in the classroom to go to the next step? But because high liability training is so sequential, we really need to drill it down. And in that way, Sheriff Anderson referred to the liability. We too at the academy and with the council, we're concerned about a liability, but what we're most concerned about is safety and life safety and dignity. And that means in the class and again at work. And if you're training firearms, you're not going to be attending a firearms training called 2 hours of awareness training. We want to apply that same level of responsibility to all of our topics so that we can see what to do. Does that make sense?
It does. So I think Representative Waters Evans has a question.
I didn't want to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Just to get more specific about it, because I'm sorry if this is an elementary question here, but I'm struggling with how exactly do we evaluate competency? Is there a test? Is it an oral exam? Is it a collection of skills that you master that's checked off by an instructor? That's the first part of my question, just like on a really simple level, because I'm just trying to understand like what the difference is between the two. And then the follow-up question would be, what would happen if you weren't competent? Would you have to repeat the training? Would there be like, is there individualized instruction on a certain area to get you to that point? Like, I'm not sure I understand how it would work or how it does work.
And are you asking that with regards to just the FIP training or in general in our training?
You can talk specifically about the FIP training, just
Okay.
how that would look just on like the most simple, like kind of fact-based level.
So like I said, this last go around with the FIP training only required attendance. So they didn't demonstrate competency in that area. The vision for us would be fair and impartial policing is a broad topic. Underneath that broad topic of fair and impartial policing, what other training do we need to be responsible for? Is it participation in implicit and explicit bias training? Is it cultural competency? Is there, there's been a lot of confusion about how to identify where somebody is from or what race or ethnicity they are. And we've gotten practical feedback that some of the younger people coming into the academy don't understand world geography and may not know where Asia is. So we can test for competency with a written test, but we also are in the business of adult learning, and adult learning includes combining learning strategies. Some people are better at written exams. There is a lot of practical application at the academy. So you're not, if you're doing evac training, which is the driving training, you're likely going to be driving. You will be taking a written exam around what you're supposed to do, or maybe the rules, but the driving testing is in the car. That's how competency would be measured. If it's managing a crisis situation from someone in the community, then the skills will be taught, and then the scenarios will be provided with role players. And each scenario will have a set of skills to, I think we overuse de-escalate because it doesn't, we don't all mean the same thing when we say de-escalate, but the point is, there are two things we want to do on the job. One is not make the situation worse, which does happen, and we can train around that. And the second is to resolve it as quickly and safely as possible with people's dignity intact and safety for the officer. Those can be walkthrough, those can be role plays, and there's also a way, the new learning and competency in the classroom looks a lot like a check for understanding, where you may call on one person, but everyone else is listening to the answer. And that is a way to be time efficient and get people to partner while they learn.
So Director Simons, what I'm hearing from the committee and some of the testimony we've heard today is a desire to support the move toward competency, and at the same time, some hesitation or reluctance from the, what really might have been a kind of meaningless level of accountability, but some accountability that we had in statute around, especially FIP. I think we talked about A-RIDE, and I've kind of set that piece aside because I think we figured out with the A-RIDE requirements, they're not really appropriate for all of the folks that we were trying to put them on as we were moving forward. So I think we've gotten to a good place there, but especially with something that's as intangible as FIP, I'm wondering if, and sort of applied across a lot of different parts of what you're trying to train on, would it be meaningful for us to ask for some kind of a report back from you as we move toward competency, get rid of the hour requirements? Under what kind of timeline do you think the Criminal Justice Council, as you look to do, this 3-year phase in, under what kind of timeline are you looking at having, really evolved most of your training, especially in the area fit to competency and away from attendance? And how do you think that'll play out over time?
Well, our director of training, Ken Hawkins, already is managing that with the level 3. I mean, this is training best practices. We don't need to be mandated to do this. We're already doing that, and it's a lot of work. And the thing with training in law enforcement is the second you complete building curriculum, it's obsolete if you're really keeping up with what the current needs of the community are. And so that's an enormous amount of work. A report back would be, I think that would be, we welcome that, a report back, because I think it'll help make it more clear the skill sets that we're looking at, but also the expectation. There's a bigger expectation here, is that do we all know what every certified officer does? Do we know what they need them to do? And I know that is a discussion on the periphery that's outside of today. But when Sheriff Anderson refers to level 1, level 2, level 3, most people don't know what that means. But I can tell you, in the most practical level, if you narrow it down to hours, level 3 is closer to 800 hours and level 2 is closer to 80 hours. And so that's concerning for me. That's why I don't measure hours. What are they going to be certified in when they finish, and what can they do, and what are they allowed to do, and who's supervising that? If there's no change to this, we'll continue the way that we already are, and that is that we require performance objectives for our training, and we will continue to make the same recommendations. But again, I want to also remind you that the chief, sergeant, a chief, a commander they ought to be taking a different level training in topics than a new recruit. They have organizations to run. There is a system approach to every bit of content, whether it's vulnerable populations, working with an aging population, youth and crime. They all have different issues and challenges systemically. And so, to me, it doesn't always make sense that your chief is going to take the same training as your first year officer. And that's because there's a mandate to attend a specific training for a specific number of hours. And we could expand and create a lot more advanced training, which is what I think we ought to be doing today and moving forward.
So while we're on this, and after hearing the testimony this morning, committee, I'd like to throw out there the suggestion that we, in the next draft of this bill, potentially for after 4 this afternoon, if Tim is available to work something up, that we just put a report back in this bill, because I think I really want to hear what the VJC has asked for. I also want to honor the concern that our colleagues in previous biennia have had about especially fair and impartial police training and making sure that that's prioritized. But I really want to honor this move toward competency. I think there's consensus in the community and the folks that we heard from that are in this business of training law enforcement officers around that. But how does the committee feel about including just a report back so that we know next year we got to come and check in with Director Simons about, how is this really going? We can check in with advocates about what they're seeing in terms of fair and impartial policing and bias, et cetera. Representative Hooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What, in regard to the comment that Sheriff made about the staff of the academy being sort of transient, what do you think would be the criteria for consistency in the evaluation of the competencies?
What, yeah, I'm sorry. I don't remember what Mark said specifically about that. I mean, in terms of the staff supporting this?
There's no professional staff, that it's basically volunteer?
Oh.
Adjunct instructors, Heather.
Thank you, Mark. Sorry. Okay. I mean, Sheriff. Sorry about that too. So this is, I think this is a little bit, this is a little complex, because I think what's implied when you hear that the academy is really dependent on volunteers from departments, it kind of implies that we should have more staff, and we should be training all in-house. And I want you to remember, we're talking about hundreds of different topics, and the pressure on the departments to provide trainers is real, and the shortage is real, and it's no easy task. But if we can find a way to get in front, with recruiting and hiring, and if there's an additional way to support agencies who are sending their volunteers, my opinion is that we should stick to this. This is what keeps us current. When you bring people off the road and you put them in the classroom, you stay current. And the expectations for instructors to become instructor certified and to keep up with the national standards brings a really healthy turnstile into the situation where we are not falling behind. We are not training only in one way or in a vacuum. And so though I appreciate that it's really, really hard, I would want to find a way to continue doing that. Because we have people from all over the state participating. We're not getting just one agency voice or just one individual or 5 or 6 individuals. And you couldn't hire enough. We couldn't hire enough staff on site if we held it all in-house anyway. And we really need to be responsible for the really high liability areas, coordinating instructor development. And that's part of the larger 3-year project as well, is that we have standards for instructors and certification and for training assistants. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. So Heather, we are going to be breaking in a couple of minutes for lunch, and then we'll all be on the floor at 1. And then I was going to have the committee come back and just talk through both some of our budget requests and then return to a little bit of committee discussion about what we heard this morning. Do you have any parting words for us that you'd like us to be thinking about? I think after this testimony this morning, hearing what else the committee has concerns or thoughts about, I'll start to get a sense of whether we can move the bill end of this week or when we get back from town meeting break. But wanted to just see if you have any kind of closing remarks for this morning or anything you think we should be paying attention to in particular that we might not have focused on this morning.
I appreciate the invitation to do that, and I'll be quick. I just, I want to add, again, I've said it before, but the work of the auditor's office was incredible and detailed and comprehensive. That we'd be behind without that. That was a really critical first step in providing information about baseline training expectations. We were grateful at the time. It's a lot of work, but it's brought us in the direction that we want to go. And now what we also would really appreciate is to keep in mind where agencies fell down or where we all discovered discrepancies, that we're operating with 12 people serving roughly 1,300 officers. And that's, in most cases, it was bookkeeping and housekeeping and a real, I think, a very accurate picture of how much more should happen in order to be transparent. And the agency with the policy that didn't have the language right. Can you hear that?
Yeah,
I don't know if you
yes.
got it.
Must be the neighbor.
I think it's had enough of me. So in summary, we're grateful for that.
Well, we'll be in touch, Director Simons. Really appreciate you helping us think through in more detail some of this move toward competency, and we may have some draft language to look at that asks for a report back. I think that's something that the committee will want to ask for. So we'll get that to you and keep this conversation going. For now, I think we're going to adjourn and we'll be on the floor at 1 and then back here after the floor to talk about budget recommendations and where we're going with this particular bill this afternoon.